Family, ethnicity, race, the human race as a whole are patterns. Fractal patterns that correspond with all the other patterns we see in this world. Some people have a lot in common with us, our family. A larger group have less in common, our ethnicity and race. And an even larger group have even less in common, the human race as a whole. There are always exceptions, but generally speaking, that's the pattern. Spiritual life is also like this, and to a large extent, not completely, but to a large extent, the two concepts overlap. Because, and this is the theme of this channel, there is ultimately no separation between subject and object. The subject evaluates its objects based on its own nature and composition. The subject uses the only reference standard it has, itself, to judge the objects before it. Because all judgment occurs based off of a reference standard which the judge already has in his possession. To the extent the subject recognizes itself, or rather the higher self it aspires to, in an object, it accepts and exalts that object. To the extent the subject doesn't see itself, or the self that it aspires to in that object, it rejects or dismisses it. Race, ethnicity, family represent a particular spirit. They are material manifestations of particular spiritual qualities. We can see this with individuals. People have a certain spirit to them. Certain men have an obvious warrior spirit. You can even see it in their physiognomy. Other men have a very peaceful spirit. Some men have a very intense and active spirit. Others a very calm and placid one. We're not supposed to talk about this anymore, but it's the same with race and ethnicity. For example, see how Frithjof Schuon mentioned the Japanese, Mongols, and Red Indians as at different times having embodied the warrior or heroic side of the yellow race. And as I said, those spirits tend to overlap to a large extent or resonate with certain spiritual traditions. For example, it's obvious that generally speaking, Christianity tends to fit the sensibilities of people of European descent. Again, this isn't an absolute rule, but generally speaking, and we know that modernity, and the modern West in particular, is allergic to generalizations, but generally speaking, people of European descent tend to find resonance with Christianity. Conversely, people of Eastern Asian descent generally find resonance with more impersonal traditions like Buddhism, Taoism, or Shintoism. And if you've ever spent time in East Asia and felt the spirit of that place and those peoples, that would make perfect sense to you. Since concepts like individualism and sentimentalism don't play a major role there as they do in Western societies. Therefore, we can see why the very dramatic, emotional, and personal story of Christianity resonates so strongly in a place where drama, emotion, and personality are such a major factor of life. Judaism is probably the most obvious example of this. Generally speaking, Judaism resonates with people who are ethnically Jewish, whether they be born and raised into it or else born and raised atheist and secular and return to it later, because their ethnicity, like all ethnicities, is a material manifestation of a particular spirit. And that particular spirit tends to resonate with the spirit of Judaism. That doesn't mean that ethnicities or individuals who are a minority in a particular religious tradition are inferior in any way. Quite the opposite. They bring in a fresh and novel perspective that enriches the tradition and keeps it from becoming just a sort of ossified cultural or ethnic institution, instead of a spiritual one. Because a true spiritual tradition has to transcend racial or ethnic boundaries to demonstrate its transcendence of the spirit over the letter. And just a closing note on why the left and the right both miss the mark on race. The left wants to claim that race is a purely superficial construct, that it has no meaning, which makes sense since the left are essentially the ambassadors of meaninglessness in the world. While the right, who are obsessed with competition and vainglory, and have turned race into an idol, want to claim that race exists in a hierarchy, with some races or racial civilizations superior to others. The reality is the same as with individuals themselves. Race exists in a balance. Where one race is strong, another is weak, and vice versa. And where one race lacks, the other compensates, and vice versa. It's like a game of rock, paper, scissors. As with everything else, there's always a balance. The West, in particular, needs to understand, and this applies to religion as well, that two things can be different but equal at the same time, whether it be two races, two people, or two apparently contradictory religious points of view.